So our next speaker is Dr. Soumya Sharma from English and Foreign Languages University, Lucknow.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I am Soumya, and I'm going to be making a presentation on language psychology and gender. Now, the way I plan to go about this presentation is that my talk is divided into three sections. I'm going to begin with the last part, gender, then psychology, and then we move on to language. The reason is that both gender and psychology feed into language. That's the way I look at it. Okay. Though it can be argued that language also feeds into psychology and gender. So you can say it's like it's like all three of them sort of informing each other. Let's put it this way. Okay. Okay. So most of you sitting over here are teaching assistants, right? Either in your doing your PhD or doing your masters, right? The first three components are very common. You require an educational qualification, right? You require basic knowledge of content. You require some kind of teaching or research experience. The last two components is what I'm interested in and what I'm going to focus on, right? The last two components are normally considered indirect indicators or indirect, you could say, catalysts, okay, in the communication process. Okay. The reason is that gender is actually, you could say, it's like an invisible but visible presence. Okay. So is psychology, right? I've used the term psychology of communication over here, right? Why? Because when you communicate, you don't just, it's not just verbal language that's at play. There are multiple things that are at play, right? Sometimes your communication involves your body language, and sometimes your communication involves your, cognition and emotions working in tandem. Sometimes your communication is more like a mind game. So both these aspects is what I'm going to focus on, okay, vis-a-vis language. So the first part. When my research actually, just a small bit, before I start off, my research focuses on language psychology and gender, the interface between language psychology and gender. So when we say language and psychology, okay, I'll share with you certain aspects of how gender works language. Okay. And then you can probably understand how you can see it in your interaction with your, let's say, your batchmates, how you can see it in interaction with, the class that you're tutoring, okay, how you can see it in interaction with your colleagues in general. Fine? So when we talk about gender, the first thing that we say is, you can see gender in terms of number, okay? In terms of diversity. For example, if you look at, this lecture hall right now, okay, we have both male and female, participants, okay, right? I could have used the word, please note, I could have used the word when I said we have both male and female participants. I could have used the word we have both male and female students and teachers. I could have, right? Why didn't I? I said participants. Any guesses? Anybody? No. It shows diversity, but my question is, why did I use the word participant? Why didn't I say students and teachers? Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I didn't want to categorize people in some kind of hierarchy. So what I'm trying to tell you is, even when I'm speaking to you, I am using gender as a metacognitive skill. Does this make sense? It is not something, gender is not something, obviously it can be taught. I teach language and gender courses, in my campus, right, at my campus. But the point is, you have to be aware of how gender enters your life and how it enters your interaction, your everyday interaction. Because what I understand is, from Sir's lecture and from the workshop is, you are going to interact with a bunch of students, right? A set of students will be assigned to each TA. So there is a lot of interaction involved there. So you have to be conscious of your choices. Fine? Gender enters the way we think and we feel. Okay? More of that when I come to the psychology part. Okay? It enters the way we think and we feel. For example, there are a lot of studies that clearly state that, stereotypical studies, if you see, that will state that emotional displays are very common for women. But emotional restraint is common in men. What am I doing now? Categorizing, right? I am categorizing, right? But when we talk about gender and language, we have to move beyond the categorization. We have to move beyond the stereotype or the norm, right? Most sociological and psychological perspectives will tell you the ways in which human beings, okay, largely learners, okay, are gendered. Because an educational institution, okay, or let's say an office workspace, okay, is one of the hotbeds for understanding gender and communication. Because you will find maximum number of norms, practices, stereotypes over there. Okay. There are some that I'd like to share with you, okay. These are some of the most you could say seminal studies in language and gender, right? So the first one is by this linguist called Robin Lakoff. She says very clearly, and she's talking about communication for women. So she says that women have to speak in a particular way where they sound feminine, but they also sound assertive. So they cannot sound masculine enough. They have to sound feminine. That means they have to sound gentle. And they have to be assertive and firm. If they tip the balance in either of the cases, that means they are a little too feminine or a little too assertive, okay? The communication will go wrong for them. Another study by Julia Davies, okay, is about gender in the classroom, actual classroom interaction. And she states very clearly, she's actually done this paper where she states that she's working on college and student level communication. And she says that the ways in which boys and girls or male students and female students talk is very different. In the classroom, repetitively over a period of time, okay, the female students were sort of expected to be more obedient. Okay, in terms of what they spoke, in terms of their body language, even in terms of how they dressed. The male students were allowed to be boisterous. They were allowed to joke around in the class. Maybe even sometimes raise their voice, to crack a joke or say something. Or if the teacher is teaching, raise their hands and comment on something, right? And this was a division that was repetitively seen by Julia Davies. Right? Another study, okay, and this is in our Indian context, Nandini Bhattacharya. She studies, she did this research in, Delhi, college and school-going students in Delhi, okay? And she found the same pattern, except that this was very culture-specific to India, okay? Many of the schools, and we are talking here, class 9, 10th, 11th, 12th students, where, the students have become adolescents, right? Okay? She finds and she says that many times what happens is, she interviewed the students, she interviewed the teachers. The students gave her separate responses. The teachers actually told her that, when we allow the boys to be assertive and to shout in the class, it's accepted. The girls are supposed to be obedient, matches with Davies' studies. But many times when we feel that the girls are overstepping their gender norm. Okay? Like they're not supposed to be this, but they are actually speaking in this manner. Like they're being very assertive, or they're asking too many questions, you know. Then we sort of subdue them. We tell them, no, no, it's okay. I'll talk to you after the class about this, or something like that. Okay. So mostly, through Lakoff's study, through Davies' study, and through Bhattacharya's study, okay, we find that gender hierarchy or gender divisions are actually very common in educational institutions, right? Even when we claim that we're not practicing it, it's let's just put it this way, it's subconsciously there. It exists, okay? Right? Now, how do you sort of undo this problem? The next point, there's a study by Bergwall and Remlinger, okay? These are researchers and they worked on postgraduate students, masters. I think these students were doing their masters in English, okay? And they recorded how the instructor was explaining some aspects of Shakespeare's play, okay? The behavior of some of the students, okay, could be divided into two categories. The way they interacted with each other and the way they interacted with the instructor could either be put as class disruptive or as a class continuative task. That basically means what? Either they are, when the instructor is speaking, they are talking amongst themselves, okay? That is class disruptive, clearly, okay? Or when the instructor is speaking, they are passing snide comments on somebody, okay? Right? Bergwall and Remlinger actually said that many of the boys were passing snide comments on the girls. This is what they found in their study, okay? While the girls in the class, okay, actually engaged in class continuative behavior in the sense that they raised their hands to either comment on the text or to ask a pertinent question from the instructor. Right? Now, when I state this study, I don't mean it's a classical division, because Bergwall and Remlinger also state it is not that, you know, on the basis of what I'm saying, it seems as if all the mischief is being done by the male students, okay, and all the female students extremely obedient. No, it's not like that. Bergwall and Remlinger say that when it comes to gender and being conscious of language use, a very important aspect is power dynamics at play. Who's talking to whom? Who's talking to whom? Right? Okay. That is why you see these questions. When we talk about gender in the class, okay, or when you as a TA interact with a group of students, okay, you need to be conscious of this. Who is doing the talking? Are you allowing some people to talk more? Are you allowing some people to ask more questions? Are there some girls or some boys who are always in the answering position? Are you conscious of your language use? Are you conscious of your language use? For example, okay, we say that if you want to see how gender is used in the class, okay, you should avoid using sexist language. That means maintain gender neutrality. So a basic component of this would be that you stop using gender-specific pronouns. That means instead of using more of he, she, you try and use more of they, them. Okay. Instead of using more words like, you know, salesman, saleswoman, okay, or chairman, chair, there's nothing like chairwoman, but yeah, chairman, you tend to use more gender neutral terms like salesperson, chairperson, okay. You also shift your language to become more inclusive. For example, okay, you want to say something like, you know, ex-student let's say they're not good with language. They do not know how to speak and write. Okay. So one way of saying this is that they need more practice. You just rephrasing the point to become more neutral. You're toning it down. That's the aspect. Okay. Another aspect is how many people in your class are silent when you're interacting as TAs, okay, or as staff. How many people are silent? Are they always silent? Why are they silent? Can you make the class, or can you interact in such a way that people are comfortable, that they can share what they want to share with you? And when I say share, they're not sharing personal information with you. What I mean is subject-specific issues. Like, I don't understand this, or can you explain this, or things like that. Right? And both the genders should be comfortable in sharing. It is not just one specific gender that should be comfortable in sharing. Okay. Another very important aspect is gender is bound with speech styles. Okay, and this is a study by an Indian sociologist. Okay, Aparna Raiprol. Okay, she talks about her experience in teaching, right? And she interviews some of her colleagues working in teachers who are working in humanities and teachers who are working in science departments in different colleges and universities. Okay, and this is what she has to say. Many of the teachers who come from a science background say that, and this is specific to the women teachers, okay? They say that if I am a teacher and I'm teaching, let's say, a particular subject like chemistry or something like that, okay? Right? I have to speak in a particular manner to appear objective, to appear intelligent, to appear scientific, and to appear assertive, which is not her normal way of speaking. Which shows what? This should not be taken, please note, this should not be taken negatively. Okay. What I'm trying to explain to you is gender is bound up with speech styles. So you develop a particular speech style when you're working in a particular space. Right? So Raiprol says that because science is considered a more objective, okay, domain, and humanities is largely considered a little more subjective, let's put it this way, or relatively subjective, okay. Teachers develop their own speech styles when they are speaking to students in the class. So the way we speak sort of bounds up with what? It bounds up with who we are, our gender. Right? So that is why, can students, coming back to that question, can students share subject-specific information with you? As TAs, we have to speak or be conscious of our language in such a way that they are comfortable sharing subject-specific issues with you. Okay. Okay. Now let's look at psychology. One of the first things that we talk about when we talk about language and psychology is this concept that language is affected and affects culture and cognition. Okay. The three of them work together. Okay. There was this study, this is a very famous study, the Wolff-Sapir hypothesis. Okay. These are two American researchers, and they worked on a lot of tribal languages and languages of minority communities, okay, in North America and South America, right? And they basically found, one of the examples that's often given by them is that your language sort of determines the way you think. And the way you think, in a way, also determines what you speak. So they're working together. And both your language and your cognitive ability, okay, are determined or regulated by the culture in which you live, the place where you're born and brought up, the way you're socialized. Okay. So one typical example given by them is of the, the Inuit community, the Eskimos. Okay, right? The Eskimos have a lot of words for snow. A lot of words for snow. Heavy snow, okay, snowflakes, snow is drifting, light snow, multiple kinds of words. We don't have that kind of vocabulary. Why? Because they live in an area where the weather conditions are such, okay, that your culture, your cultural context is determining your vocabulary. Okay. Now, broadly, there are linguists who state that, the Wolff-Sapaya hypothesis can be found in a weak form, okay, not in a strong form, across all kinds of cultures. Okay. The reason is very simple. I'll give you a few words. Look at it this way. Okay. There is a word called metanoia. M-E-T-A-N-O-I-A. Metanoia. Okay. It's a Greek word. The word basically means a feeling of satisfaction and peace when you are homebound. Now, homebound here does not mean actually going home. Homebound means going to a place that is a safe haven for you. It need not necessarily be your home. It's got a very specific meaning. And the Greeks used it in a philosophical and spiritual sense. Right? This is specific to their culture. Okay? Take an Indian word. Okay? Take the word kabaddi. Is there an English equivalent for this? Kabaddi. You could say somebody who works in a junkyard. Anybody? Junkyard dealer. Can you give me an exact equivalent of kabaddi? No. Because it doesn't exist. Because Wolff-Sapaya hypothesis in a weak form works in across cultures. The way we speak is bound by our cognitive ability and it's bound by our cultural context. Right? Or take another word, okay, from another Indian word, okay. You've heard of the word jhuta, khana? Is there an English equivalent for that? Jhuta? Leftovers. But if you say, iski plate se jhuta khana, are you having a leftover? The meaning changes. Haan, jhuta glass se pani. You can't say leftover then, na? You're getting my point. The point I'm trying to make is that language, when you're using language, okay, psychology is an inherent part of it. That is why it is psychology of communication. Right? You have to, when you communicate, you have to understand a lot of things when you're communicating. Okay? You have to understand what the other person wants. Then your communication would be successful. Okay? Let's come to aspects that can be directly relevant for you as TLs. Okay? The first concept. Okay? This is a concept that has been discussed by multiple psychologists. Okay? A recent example is Forsyth Donaldson. Okay? Another one is D.G. Myers. Another one is Robert Barron. This is called self-serving bias. Self-serving bias basically means that I've written down a term called locus of control. Locus of control means every individual, cognitively, please understand, wants to be in control of their life, the situations that they face, right? But this is virtually not possible. Sometimes you are in control, sometimes the situations or your experiences are beyond your control, right? And so are the results. So self-serving bias tells you two things. First, situations where or experiences or tasks in which you are successful, right? You tend to attribute the success to your own self. Tasks or situations in which you failed, you tend to attribute the failure to somebody else. That's basic human behavior, basic human psychology, right? So the locus of control shifts. Sometimes when you want praise and appreciation, it is self-attribution. When you want to shift the blame, it's other attribution, right? Now, as a TA, there are two things here. First, okay, self-serving bias always affects communication, especially in the classroom. Okay. A direct offshoot, you could say, or a direct result of self-serving biases, I said two things. First, the way you approach and talk to the student, okay, directly determines the self-worth of the student in their own eyes. That means if you tell a student, let's say somebody is not able to solve a task, okay, or a mathematical problem that you've given them, or that the instructors asked you to discuss XYZ things, okay, and they're not able to do it, okay. The way you talk, your language will determine their self-assessment, okay. If you keep saying, this is so easy, I don't know why you're not able to understand it. What's wrong with you? Or if you say, this is supposed to be done this way. Or ask your friend, this guy is able to do it, why aren't you able to do it? What are you doing? You're constantly creating a self-serving bias where after a couple of tutorial classes, the learner will start feeling, yeah, he's right, she's right. This is actually very easy, I'm not able to figure it out, okay? So maybe after a couple of classes, the student actually goes to the hostel and says, I can't pass this course. It's not possible for me. Not just the instructor, even the TA is actually saying this, that there is something wrong, right? So your language directly determines their self-worth. And please note, it is not their worth, it is their self-worth, the way they are thinking about themselves. That is why I'm repeatedly using the word self-worth, okay, right? That is one. Second, okay, for students, you should be able to gauge and assess the kind of batch that's been assigned to you, okay? That the people that you are responsible for, for interacting with, let's say. If you find students in that batch, let's say a batch of 30, 40, 50, 60 students, whatever, that's assigned to you, okay? If you find students in the batch, and that batch, there are many students who say, it's not my problem, there's something wrong with this sum. It's too difficult. Why was I given this? If you teach from if the books are going to be so difficult, the explanation is going to be so difficult, how will I pass the test? That means the learner is shifting the blame. For such learners, please engage them in group projects, group assignments, right? Because self-serving bias also tells us, in terms of classroom teaching, that if it is an individual work, one person is working, it's very easy to shift the blame. If it's in a group, okay, if you don't work, other people in the group will start tattling about you and say, this person's not working, so you better start working. So self-serving bias works in two ways. The language you use, okay, and the kind of work that you assign to the students. Okay, next. Interaction with the students, okay, or teaching students, okay, involves three particular practices, okay. Mostly you will find this, that the practices are actually a part of cognitive psychology, okay. Mostly you'll find that when you're actually teaching something or explaining something to the students, okay, more than remembering, okay, be careful about forgetting. There are very few students who will actually remember. Majority of the students tend to forget, or they don't pay attention. So in psychology, we have a concept which is called the curve of forgetting. It was given by this psychologist called Ebbinghaus, okay. And the curve of forgetting says very simply that your rate of forgetting something, a concept, okay, that's been taught by you or taught by the instructor, okay, is directly proportional to the time that lapses. So Monday, the concept was taught. Tuesday, Wednesday, probably they'll remember. Wednesday afternoon, I don't remember. It's blacking out. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, I don't remember the lesson at all. So forgetting is more important. Forgetting is actually practically is what's happening just when the student steps out of the class. Or in the case of many students you'll find who are backbenchers, it's already started working in the class, right? It's a practical thing I'm telling you, right? They don't even give that time. If the lecture is 1 hour or 2 hours or whatever, okay, they're not going to give time to even imbibe that. They're like, forgetting is already started it. Okay, so how do you deal with that? Okay, 3 practices. Okay, the first is called retrieval practice. Retrieval practice is very simple. That means you interact with them on that topic concerned. Okay, let's say through some kind of objective test or some kind of a quiz or something like that. It's basically a way of asking them to remember. Retrieval. Okay, spaced practice tells you that let's say if you are asked to solve problems or you're asked to solve questions with them or conduct experiments with them, okay, maybe they don't remember a concept, okay. Maybe you can spend 5 minutes just interacting with them about that concept or casually mention that, this can be done this way also, right? And it has to be spaced out. That means, let's say, week 1, week 2, week 3, okay? Not every week. Week 1, week 3, something like that, okay? And feedback, normally we understand feedback as, students giving feedback on a tutor or an instructor's class teaching, okay? Or the class teacher giving a feedback on, the way the TAs were, the students were. Feedback here is used in a very specific sense by Agarwal and Roediger. Okay, they say that feedback means that when you walk into a class, okay, without stating that what did we talk about the other day? We talked about this. Okay, without stating that you are doing a recap, you actually do a recap. They use the term feedback for that. Okay, and you don't do a recap of all the concepts. You do a recap of a specific concept that is relevant to what you're going to do that day only. Right? How does this help? This all retrieval practice, spaced practice, both, okay, and even feedback, okay, cognitively tunes the learner to sort of understand that this is what is being asked of me. I better focus on this task. That's it. So they will become more task-oriented, okay? Why? Because psychology tells us that attention spans cannot last for more than 40 to 45 minutes neurologically. So if you ask them to focus, make their work task-oriented, make their attention task-oriented. That's it. Okay. Fine. Another aspect is the use of routines. Okay, use of routines is normally used in classrooms by teachers when they say that you need to establish very clearly how my class is going to be, how I am going to go about the class, what I expect of people, and how do I expect that you're going to behave in the class. Okay, so one simple idea, one simple routine that is often used by teachers is accountability and accessibility. That means you might have students who might say, I didn't understand this. I won't be able to function. Can I submit the assignment another day, let's say. Or I actually wanted to come and ask you about this, but something happened to my friend, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So you make it clear in the class that this is the way my routine, this is what I expect out of you. That means you better give me an explanation for why you were not present, or why didn't you submit the work, or why haven't you done this experiment properly. The more accountability you create, the more accountable they will feel in the classroom. So they actually start participating. They're not just sitting. Okay. Then there are two more aspects. Okay. This one is called relationality of affect. Relationality of affect basically means that it's actually related to the next one. Okay. Non-verbal communication. And relationality of affect means many a times when you interact with people, they will not spell out everything for you, and neither will you. You have to be a sort of a psychologist to understand or gauge, okay, what the situation is, what they're feeling, and to respond accordingly. Right? Because relationality of affect tells you, I'll give a simple example. Let's say you're angry, very angry at something, okay? What really happens with you when you're very angry? In some cases, people will knit their eyebrows, okay? They'll raise their voice, okay? Okay. Their hands will become clammy, right? They will start sweating. In some cases, they are so angry that they will start shaking. Fine? Relationality of affect tells you you should be able to relate and understand. As simple, it's self-explanatory. You should be able to relate and understand what the other person is experiencing. So tailor your response accordingly. So a basic component in relationality of affect is active listening. Listening to what the other person is saying. But you cannot always do this. It's not an ideal situation. You cannot actively listen all the time. Okay. There are times when you'll have to make clear boundaries. Okay. You can be an active listener sometimes. Okay. You can have communication startups. That means if somebody is nervous or tense or anxious, okay, if somebody is lazy, doesn't want to work, okay, maybe you can talk to them in terms of, maybe using an icebreaker. How was your day? What went wrong with you? Something like that. Okay. But you can't do this all the time. So you need to gauge this. So it varies according to your everyday class. The everyday experience will be different. It can't be the same. Right? And this is an aspect which is very common in some students. Okay. Many times you will find students, it's not that they are just, not proficient in verbal language. Sometimes they're not proficient when it comes to non-verbal language also. For example, sometimes when learners come and talk to you, they will come, if you're standing here, they'll come right here. Right? Right here. Why? You have to actually tell them that there is some interpersonal distance that has to be maintained. Right? You don't have to say it. Okay. Because it's non-verbal communication, many things can be done non-verbally. Right? So communication, when you say language and psychology, it's not just verbal language. Okay? It's actually understanding how the learner is going to function, what's going to help them cognitively, and how to actually recognize and deal with them at the emotional level sometimes. Okay? Not always. Okay. And now I have a set of statements for you. Okay? What I want you to do is please look at these statements and take a minute and then we'll discuss. Okay, so what I want you to do is we'll actually practice the interaction. Okay? I've told you some concepts in gender, I've told you some concepts in psychology. Okay? Right? How would you respond to the first sentence? If a student comes and tells you this, what was taught is not clear. Or maybe while you're teaching, okay, anybody can answer. Maybe while you're teaching, okay, they actually stand up and say, it's not clear. Or maybe they tell you outside the class. How will you respond? Yes. What else? Yes, that can be done. What else? Yes. Okay, right. What else? What else? You'll ask them the reason why it's not clear to them. Yes, you can ask them that. What else? Clear their doubt. Okay. Now I'm rephrasing it. The student says it's not clear. Explain again. You change the example. Student persists. You do come across students like this, right? See, teaching is not, teaching is hunky-dory. Many times it actually becomes a little nerve-wracking for you. Okay.
He will ask other students also.
Who's speaking? Can I? Yeah, thank you. You will ask?
Other students also, I will ask.
You'll ask other students to pitch in, to explain.
They understand, they are able to understand or not.
Okay, that's an interesting reply. That you will ask, he says that, you'll ask other students, like, are they able to understand? And you're not able to understand, okay? You can do that. You can do that, okay? But my advice is, again, don't do it in the first or the second attempt.
We have more answers over here.
Because then you're creating a hierarchy in the class. Without saying it, you're creating a hierarchy. Yes?
Yeah, I was going to say that if someone told me this, I would say, sure, that's not a problem. I'll explain once more. And maybe use a more context-specific example to explain what I was trying to say. Maybe change the example. Like, I think someone already
Okay, you could
mentioned
do
this.
that. Okay, now I'll change the sentence slightly. Let's say you have a submission, okay? You have a submission, okay? Deadline. Okay, and the student comes and says, Abhi, explain kar do, please. I have a test. I didn't understand this. Now what will you say? You might feel that my examples are far-fetched. But what I'm trying to tell you, I'm trying to create a gamut of responses. That's what I'm trying to make you think, okay? What will you do then? You have work, okay? There's a deadline. The student also has a deadline, and they're like, no, you help me out right now. What will you do? Okay, you could say that, okay? But a better way of saying this is hedging it slightly. In language, we use the term hedging. Hedging means, okay, I can explain it to you, that's not a problem, okay? Give me some time, or let's fix a time. I need to finish this work, okay? Meanwhile, you can finish this, let's fix a time, and then we can talk. You get my point? In many situations, you can be caught, okay? Fine? Where you might get irritated with the learner, where the learner is persistent. Use hedging, okay? Hedging means you are toning down your response, okay? Instead of saying, why are you asking me this right now? Tone it down, okay? Next one, I didn't come to class because I was sick. So the student might say something like, I didn't come to your class. You might ask, why didn't you come, or why didn't you do this task? I didn't come to class, I was sick. And there can be some who might even say, can you give me your slides? Or you give me your notes. I didn't come to class. You give me your slides, give me your notes. How will you respond to that? I'll tell you the concept. Okay, maybe you can think of the answer then. Okay, the concept is, if you feel that the student is saying that, in a very subtle, okay, indirect manner, the student is saying that attending your class or the tutorial is not relevant for me. I just need the notes, or I need the slides, I'll manage on my own, right? There is something in language and communication, in language and psychology, we call as face. Face means that everybody has a public image, okay? Every individual. And no individual wants their face to be threatened, okay? Right? So what is the student actually doing? They're threatening your face, right? That's what they're doing, right? How will you respond then? See, it's nice if the classroom discussion and interaction goes well. Problem arises when the discussion does not go well. How do you deal with it then? So I've given you a problematic situation. Now respond. The student is threatening you in a very subtle manner. How will you respond? I didn't come to class, I was sick. Basically, the student is trying to say, so what? That's their language. How will you respond? Anybody? Yeah. Yeah, that's one way of responding, okay? That's one way of responding, okay? I'll give you the slides if it helps, but I'll still advise you that it's nice if you can come to the class, you learn more, okay? Another way of responding is, sure, I can give you the slides, okay? But why don't you discuss the topic with me or with your batchmates, okay? And then we can take it from there, right? Because a normal response, remember we just talked about relationality of affect. The student, if a problematic situation comes in front of you, okay, it's highly likely that you will get irritated. It's a normal human response, fine? But the art of communication is to mitigate your irritation and to give a normal response, right? Next one, we can't attend class tomorrow. We just can't attend class. Okay, we have some cultural event going on, something is happening, think of anything. How do you respond? Or the next one, I need more time to submit the assignment. Okay, yes sir.
See, the examples you're discussing and the responses that we are hearing, and you know, when I hear responses from everybody, the responses that are very nice to hear and music to ears are where you show some care, that I do care about you if you're doing something. So if I have that in mind, whenever I respond and I show care, for example, you say, I can't attend class tomorrow. No problem, let me know. If there is any problem, I'll cover it for you. And similarly, when you say, you know, what was taught was not clear, okay, let me go over the entire thing with you and see what you do. So if you on all this, if as a teacher, you show you care for your learning, no matter what, I'll take that extra step for you to learn. Probably that has a positive.
Yes, that has a positive effect. That has. If you show concern and care, it does have a positive effect, okay? But what happens when students come to you with requests like these? Both these statements, we can't attend class tomorrow, so they will say something after that. Or, I need more time to submit. How do you deal with that? Okay, you can take a makeup class, or I'll explain to you again, all right? Anyone for the second one? I need more time to submit the assignment.
The reason it's not genuine, then I have to think about it.
If the reason is not genuine, then? Yes, we have to set boundaries and be firm. So you could probably say that, you know, okay, all right, let me speak to the instructor about this. Okay. Right? Or, I don't think so it's going to be possible this time. Okay, maybe next time. Right? I do understand what you know, I understand your situation, but maybe next time. Right? Submit what you have. Yes, that's also possible. Right? What is happening in these two sentences is something again in language, okay, that we call as boiled on record strategies. Boiled on record strategies are when people come up to you and say things directly. There is nothing before or after. They just come and say things directly. This is the situation. Okay. So how do you deal with those situations? Right? Next one. Okay. Many times you could also face a situation. This one is about greetings. Okay. It's a very small aspect of communication. Greetings. It looks very trivial. Okay. How you greet somebody. Right? Happens at the beginning and end of a conversation. Right? But it can set the tone for the conversation. Many a times what happens is people do not know how to greet. Okay? So there is, let's say, a blurring of boundaries between being formal or being informal, right? So if somebody comes and speaks to you and says, hi, how are you? Okay. A normal way is to respond, hello, I'm fine, how are you? Right? Okay. But let's say you do not want the person to speak to you in that tone. You do not want to address that kind of greeting. How would you greet in return? Small thing. If it's a smooth conversation, you greet in a similar manner and it's fine. But you do not want them to address you in that way. How would you respond?
I would say, how are you? How are your studies going?
You could say, how are you? How are your studies going? Yes, okay, right? Or an easier way would be, okay, for greetings is, we say in language, either you counter greet in the same way, so the conversation continues, or you greet in a way that you want to be greeted. So without saying anything, you've set a boundary psychologically, right? So this is, hi, how are you? Hello, good morning, I'm fine. Something formal, or remove the hello, good morning, or good afternoon, yes, I'm fine. How are you? You've set a boundary without even saying that you're setting a boundary, right? Right? You ask a question in class, okay, and nobody responds. You ask a question in class and nobody responds, or they're quiet, let's say, for a few minutes, okay? How do you respond to that? The instructors asked you to do something, you ask a question, but they're not responding. How will you deal with that? Yes, but what I mean to say is, you've asked the question. You as an instructor, okay, or a TA, is asking the question. You need a response from them, but they are not responding to you. Yes, you could say that. Yes, okay. You could do that, yes, okay. Anyone, you could do that. Solve the answer, okay. Rephrase the question, okay. There is something in language which we call as a guided cue. You give them an answer in the form of a cue, okay. You could do that, okay. And the last one, okay. This is, sometimes learners might come and tell you, we want you to teach this topic, okay, right? We want you to teach this topic. We don't want him or her to teach that topic. You explain it better. What will you do? This is the last part and my slide ends after this, okay? What do you do in that case? It feels nice when somebody comes and says, indirectly they're saying that you're a good teacher. Yes, great, okay. But indirectly it's also a breeding ground for a bit of a politics. Let's put it this way. How do you deal with it? What do you say?
A general discussion.
Yes, we can have a general discussion over it, okay? You could say that, yes. Yes.
I would say that everybody has some duties to perform and let them perform their duties.
That's a good one. Yes, that's a good one. Yes, you could say that. Everybody has some duties to perform and let everybody perform their duties. Right? That's a good one. Right? These were the strategies. Hedging. Yes, okay. Yes, you could do that. Yes, that's also perfectly fine. Okay, right? All right. So these were the strategies. Hedging, maintaining face, boiled on record. Okay. How do you deal with requests, greetings? How do you deal with questions? Okay. And negative politeness. Negative politeness is a very interesting concept. This is the last one, okay, the last question, okay. When they try and impinge or impose on your space, okay, by sort of appreciating you, okay. But it can have multiple meanings, right? Or it can lead to multiple, let's say, in a direction which is not very harmonious for the conversation, right? Right? So that's it. These are my citations. You want, you can look at the works later on. Thank you. If anybody has questions, I can answer.
Any questions? So thank you, Dr. Sharma, for a wonderful talk, actually.
Thank you.
Very interactive one.
Yeah.
I would like you to comment on this. You see, whenever we talk about gender biases,
Yes.
gender-specific languages, we always tend to say that this is feminine, this is... So this
Masculine,
is some
yes.
kind of a trap.
Yes.
And that trap is for both males and females. Maybe boys also interact in a certain way because they are in that trap. How do we get them out of that trap?
Okay. We get them, basically sir is talking about, how people tend to, when they're interacting or when they're behaving or talking, they're sort of either being feminine, okay, or they're being masculine, right? In a particular, they are in a way practicing gender norms. The idea is, how do you get them out of it? You get them out of it by using gender inclusive language. First. Second, you get them out of it by using emotional intelligence, which is a part of affect. Okay. By telling them that it's okay, right? You might be a female, you might be a male. It's okay. You don't have to behave in a stereotypical manner in the classroom. You can just behave as a student, right? For example, I'll give a small example. This is related to men, okay? This is not related to women, okay? This is, mostly it's considered for men that they, you've heard of this phrase called, being rough and tough, right? That's normally what's considered, that if you're a man, you should be rough and tough, okay? But why is that always the case? I mean, if you talk about the psychology of emotions, there are so many studies to prove that emotional expression is equal in men and women. It is society that sort of constructs it in a particular way, that women can emote and express, men cannot or are not supposed to emote and express. So why do this? Okay. So first is using gender neutral language. The second is asking them to actually go beyond the gender norm. So maybe using emotional intelligence in that sense. Okay. Asking them to express themselves. Right? Okay. There's two ways.
Thank you.